The man in the bathroom. So, this particular incident happened when I was 5 or 6 on a field trip to a local museum. So we got to the museum and everything was going fine, but then I really had to use the restroom. My teacher was preoccupied, as were all the chaperones, so they sent me by myself as I was very responsible. So anyways, I go to use the restroom when a girl around 17 or 18 goes into the restroom. The bathroom was in a corner, so it wasn't very visible. Anyways, a creepy-looking man sneakily walks up, sort of behind the girl, turns to me and whispers, "Shh," then follows the girl into the bathroom. I know this was not right at all, so I went up to a security guard and told him that a man had just followed a pretty girl into the bathroom. The guy got taken away by the police, and I never heard about him again. I guess it was just really good judgment and instinct on my part. Never go alone in downtown Toronto. I was reading a bunch from this subreddit, and one creepy one brought to my mind the other awful creeper that I encountered. I was in 9th grade back in Toronto, and we had a class field trip for geography, where we'd go on a set route and explore parts of the city, taking notes as we went. Naturally, we were supposed to be in groups. At the time, I was really into wearing elephant pants and baggy shirts, because I didn't feel comfortable dressing more girly or showing off my body because, well, I just like the baggy clothing. So much easier to be comfortable with no effort at all. So that day, picture a tall girl with giant elephant pants, a baggy red Nintendo shirt, and blonde hair. I was supposed to be with my friends, but I had crappy friends back then and they ditched me to go shopping. I continued along our route on my own when some average-looking middle-aged black guy approached me. He said I was pretty, and my first reaction was, "Have you looked at my clothing?" Then he asked what I was doing alone, and I replied going to meet my teacher and briefly explained our assignment. He said he'd accompany me and explain some of the sites on my list, and I just kept walking and he followed. He came across as very intelligent, showing multiple languages and possessing a general abundance of knowledge. My friends eventually showed up, and when they saw me, and I asked them for help, they just shrugged and kept going. We came close to a church, and he insisted on bringing me inside because he went to church there and he wanted me to see it. I was honestly too scared to say no. I went with him, and he proceeded to grope me and try to make out with me. He made it even creepier by asking me to bury a white cloth in the dirt in my garden and to say his name while doing it. He said he would do it too, and that his wife wouldn't mind. I managed to get out and found my teacher. We went to the police, and they did swab tests and took my statement, but I didn't know if they ever found him. I probably didn't help the situation by literally washing my mouth out with soap. To this day, I will not go out in the city at night if I'm alone, and preferably never during the day as well. So, creepy guy in a blue windbreaker preying on little girls. Let's not meet again. Beekeeper Creeper. So, this is my first time making a Reddit post, so apologies in advance if I make any newbie mistakes. When I was little, my mom devoutly took me to a local Christian church. On the whole, it was a positive experience, though I did grow up to be a non-theist, Buddhist pagan, but that's a story for another subreddit. So, our family had many close friends within the church. However, even as a little kid, there was one man who never sat right with me. His smile always seemed a little too forced. He never looked like he got enough sleep ever. He always smelled weird, and to top it all off, he was just about the tallest guy I've ever seen. Even now, being full grown, I'm only 4'10", so you can't imagine how intimidating this man almost seemed, with him being 7 feet tall. When he would talk to me or my mom, he was always putting his hands on our shoulders, or was always standing too close. My best friend at the time had severe personality disorders, so I always related his behavior to hers, and thus excused it. I was a part of Scout-style club at the time, which focused on agriculture and farming. We were always looking for new field trips to explore different locations, so my mom put out the word to our church that we were seeking farms to visit and the like. We had a couple offers, but the one we took was that of the tall man's. He owned a small beekeeping lot attached to his yard. I was excited. I'd always loved bugs, especially bees. The day came, and we all drove down to his lot. It was across from an old pre-1840s graveyard, which I found cool, but unsettled most of the other kids. The tall man met us in his driveway, which is when I noticed a lack of beekeeping equipment. He had a smoker attached to his belt and a prying knife for the frames in the bee boxes, but no head shield, gloves, or iconic white beekeeper jumpsuit. He showed us a few laminated sheets with the bee anatomy and behavioral facts, which was fascinating enough. But then he began to eagerly explain the mating process of bees. If you aren't familiar, here's a summary. It's super messed up. The parent chaperones were uneasy, and I think he could tell, because he cut the lesson short. He then took us to an expanse of grass with multiple boxes, which had loads of bees placidly buzzing around, much to my delight. He approached the box, smoked it, and cracked the lid. Bees were landing on him, but it was as if he didn't even notice. He pulled out a frame and showed everyone the honeycomb, which crawled with sluggish bees and goopy honey. All I could focus on was the worker bees on his hands, which were flying erratically and stinging his fingers. We were about to leave when the tall man took me aside. My mom was talking to another parent yards and yards away, and all the other kids were playing near the cars, so I was completely alone. And then he put his hand firmly on my shoulder, seeming almost nervous in a way. "You know I care about you, right? I care very much for you and your mother. You know that, right?" he said. I'll never forget how shaky his voice was, and how tight his stung fingers were gripped on me. "Yes," I replied hastily, worming out of his grip. He let me go, and trying to calm down, I sprinted to my mom. "See you at church next Sunday," he called to my mother in a cheery voice, far different from the one he used on me only seconds earlier. She cordially bid him farewell. I was scared to tell her what he said, so I didn't until years later. She told me that she has always gotten a weird vibe from him as well. He had stopped coming to church after that, so I didn't see much of him. I fancy myself to be a solid but forgiving judge of character, but I am completely serious when I say, Beekeeper Creeper, let's not meet again. Shroomin'. Let me start by saying we were not on shrooms, just hunting for them. This story takes place in Alabama, around the middle of summer 2012. My hometown is pretty small, with a population of around 30,000. Basically, from the center of town, you can travel 5 miles in any direction, and you'll definitely come across a cow pasture. The house I grew up in lies on the edge of the city line, so across the street from my backyard is miles and miles of woods and old farmland. As a kid, I ventured into these fields with my dog and explored a good bit of the area. A creek runs along the edge of the pasture where the story takes place. The road I lived on came to a dead end about a mile from my house, and at the end of the road lies the rusted steel skeleton of a bridge some teenagers had burned down in the 80s. My dad and uncles grew up in the neighborhood, and according to them and my grandmother, a kid had died there in the late 70s after having a seizure and drowning in the creek, so the vibe around that bridge at night was naturally a creepy one. So, tons of adventures and happy memories made in these woods around the creek as a kid. Nothing bad ever happened for years, which should have been the first red flag. I mean, come on. rusty old burned-down bridge sitting at the end of a lonely road with fields on either side, filled with 2,000-pound horned beasts roaming through them, not to mention the possibility of meth addicts, rednecks, or wild animals you don't consider when worrying about angry bulls. But we'll get to that later. The folklore of the Tennessee Valley is full of stories about ghosts and creatures that supposedly roam this area. One of these stories involves a white howler, which was supposed to be some sort of strange Bigfoot-style thing that screams sounds just like a woman being murdered, which strangely is exactly what cougars sound like when they're in heat. The first time I actually heard this sound was before I knew about the cougar scream, and I'd only heard the old story of the white howler, which I totally thought was BS. The first time I told a friend about hearing the sound, something happened that I won't ever forget. That fucking screaming started again, coming from the same area as before, and following me saying, and it sounds like it was just ready, waiting for my verbal cue. Eventually, the high school years came, and I started drinking and smoking weed the end of sophomore year. The cow pasture now served a much more deviant purpose for me. Any trip that was now spent burning one in the nostalgic and paranoid-free embrace of Mother Nature. I had heard the crazy scream earlier that year, and told Josh about it, and usually made my trips into the field during the day at that point. Now, one of these fine days, I ran across a pile of cow shit. But not just any pile, folks, no, because upon this patty sat the biggest magic mushroom I've ever seen in my entire life. The cat was maybe 6 inches across. Needless to say, I picked it up, ate it on a sandwich, and generally tripped my balls off. So skip forward to 2012 and I'm 21 years old. I lived in an apartment across town with my friend who grew up in the same neighborhood named Josh. He was the one with me when we heard that well-timed cougar scream that we'd since learned the facts on. The fact is, the scream we heard was coming from a predatory cat that grows to around 7 feet in length. You start to wish for the mythical beast that just tries to scare you and not potentially hunt you down for fun in the dark like cats do to their prey. 'Cause let's face it, folks, cats are fucking scary. But anywho, I grew up with my grandma, and she still lives in the same house on the edge of town since the original discovery of the mother shroom that fateful day. I located the main clusters, which were under a row of trees about a half-mile into the field. Josh and I had made many a trip to pick them when there were just moonlights enough to see without having to use a flashlight too much. It had been about a year since I last went, so Josh and I decided to go for the hell of it. We put on some old dark clothes we didn't mind ruining, and drove to the old house and parked the car. We got out and began to walk down the road to the creek, where we always went in to avoid being seen from the road. Cops will randomly come down that road to check the dead end where meth-addled hillbillies must surely come and make their DDs. Way too many cars made obviously sketchy detours down this road all the time, only to merge back at the stop sign minutes later. So, as we came to the bridge, we stopped talking and started to walk down the trail leading along the edge of the creek. About 20 yards down, our silence is broken by a giant rock hitting the water. Now, I just don't mean just like a small stone, and I don't mean just falling. There was just like a huge stone being thrown, and it made that deep crump sound, something that heavy makes when it hits the water. I've seen and heard dozens of beavers splash into the water, and although they're not light animals, their splash has a smoothness to it, and that jagged rock doesn't have. So I'm totally ruling those out too. We freeze up and stand there in silence for about a minute before moving on, thinking maybe it just fell, because that's totally logical. But as we were approaching the entrance to the main field, I told him to hold on and listen for just a second, and I shit you not, right as we both fell silent, a splash, a little bigger than before, erupted as if on cue. Now, why didn't we nope the fuck out of there at this point? I couldn't tell you, but we didn't. We just walked quickly towards a shroom patch, and away from whatever was throwing rocks into a creek at 2 a.m. At this point, the weird timing of the rocks to coincide with me saying to stop and listen was reminding me of the perfectly timed cougar scream a few years back. Now, to clarify, I've never seriously considered the howler was a real thing, but after the oddly well-timed ungodly scream and the rocks being thrown into the creek, I was just waiting for some ungodly creature straight out of the X-Files to appear out of the darkness and belt out that scream of death right into my face. Or in a much worse turn of events, for it to be a crazy person enough to be throwing rocks at people in the woods at 2 a.m. If Reddit Letsnotmeet has shown us anything, it's that those people exist, and they're basically around every single corner. So, as we moved away from the tree line, we paused to check out the cow situation. A few bulls were in between us and the rest of the herd, so we circled around and made our way to the main stop we hunted at. We didn't have very much luck finding any in the usual spot, but there were other less reliable spots throughout the field, so we decided to stick it out and continue the hunt. We turned our flashlights off and walked about 100 yards further into the fields when we arrived at the fence line, marking the second spot. At that moment, we heard something that sounded heavy, moving about 10 feet away. Then a deep grunting and snarling sound. We both turned on our flashlights to reveal two fully grown wild hogs, their white tucks shining prominently in the artificial light. About 30 yards behind us is a fence line with a broken cheddar tree next to it that a person could jump into if they needed to. Being a paranoid stoner, I had mentally marked this just in case this exact shit went down. We sprinted to the fence with me yelling frantically about this tree up ahead, and we both climbed up and pointed our flashlights back at the ground. No hogs in sight, so we waited a few minutes to make sure the coast was clear, and then climbed down. We went straight through the field, instead of going around, cause we didn't care about being spotted too much at that point. Went home shroomless and totally creeped out, cause we never figured out what the rocks were about. But it wouldn't be the last time we got fucked up in the woods. I have a few weird stories about the area I grew up in if anyone cares. Sort of this story doesn't exactly fit, but it was a thoroughly creepy story to actually sit and type out for me. So I hope you guys actually enjoy it, you know? Oh, and my bad for being long-winded, but I tend to like the really long stories, and this wasn't exactly a 3-paragraph experience. So why write it like one was, right? Anyways, wild boars, the cougar down the road screaming like a half-murdered banshee, and finally the creepy guy who maybe was in the woods that night. Let's not meet, okay?